Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on climate change transition risks today. I'm Tina Shear. I'm the Executive Director of Energy and Climate Change here at Business New Zealand. And today we are delighted to partner with Aurecon, a design, engineering, and advisory company, to talk about how business and boards can navigate their way to carbon zero. As we can see around the world, more and more consumers want to support companies that incorporate climate change action into their business models. But obviously, the question is, what's the best way for business to address climate change? Today's session is designed to provide you with a better understanding of what are the choices and what direction you might want your business to travel so you can actually move with more confidence to carbon zero. So in the next 30 minutes or so, we will hear from our speakers on what are they seeing around the world happening and how this translates to New Zealand. But we will also hear about the advantages, obviously, of New Zealand and the role the government should take. At the very end, there will be also 15 minutes for you to ask some of the burning questions. We would like to ask you to post these questions in the Q&A function, which you should see to your right on the screen. But without further ado, it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our facilitator today, Aurecon's advisory lead in New Zealand, Tom Wormsley. Tom is known for his extensive expertise in business transformation and growth, project optimization and delivery, as well as organization design. He has also a deep knowledge in New Zealand markets across various sectors such as electricity, manufacturing, retail, construction, infrastructure. He's passionate about the debates that stimulate critical thinking and draw out ideas that challenge the status quo. It's a very critical skill as we're managing supply chains, increasing costs, and climate change transition. So without doubt, you will be in good hands today. Tom, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, Tina, and thank you. That's quite billing. I sound quite impressive. And thank you all for joining this hui. It's a delight to have you here, and we have two amazing speakers that I will introduce in a minute. So, ko Tom Wormsley toku ingoa. I am delighted to be with you this week. It's quite a week to be having this conversation with the the emissions reduction budgets announced yesterday. Budget to come on Thursday, and then the government's response, obviously encapsulated within that and beyond. So I lead Aurecon's advisory business here in Aotearoa, and excited to be part of the transition journey with some people that are on this call and clients that are on this call, but also more broadly into government and other parts of the economy that we support. My hope and aspiration for Aotearoa is that we can replicate what we did with FPOS in the 80s, where we became this test bed of, with scale and skills and an appetite for innovation and exploration that's in our DNA that made that kind of rollout successful. And I think you add to that a little te ao Māori, which we bring in the 21st century. And I think that we can be amazing on a global context in shaping climate change, and not only our successes, but what we can export in terms of intellectual property or case studies or technology. And I really liked, I was at the Infrastructure Symposium last week where I heard a lot of people talk. I heard James Kilty talk, and he described it as decarbonising through growth, not contraction. And I thought that was such an awesome challenge for us to, set as the watermark for global energy transition. So that's my aspiration. I'll hand over to Paul, who's Aurecon's global lead for sustainability and climate change, as well as our director for energy. And then Felicity, who is the head of, or the director for New Zealand and East Australia for Fortescue Future Industries. And I'll get them to introduce themselves in a second. I've got the series of questions to pose them, which will start by looking outwards in sort of global context and what we're seeing and what we can learn. Looking inwards in the context and where we are in New Zealand now and what they're seeing. And then looking forwards, what we might hope to see in the budget coming up and what we think are the key risks and opportunities for that, for us as businesses to take on. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul, who's going to talk about the global context and where there are notable global trends and changes and challenges that are being emerging emerging over the past few years. And then I'll get him to hand to Felicity to introduce herself and talk a little bit about FFI and the amazing work that they're doing. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Tom. And yeah, look, great to be here talking to everyone today. Before I start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Turrbal people who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So look, in terms of, I think, global trends on the topic of climate transition risk and climate risk more broadly, I've obviously been reflecting a bit on that question and thinking, well, what are some of the most notable things of the last few years? And for me, one of the things that's been clear is just how much the pandemic has shifted and raised the focus on sustainability and climate change, which to me is a fabulous thing and perhaps something of a surprise. When the pandemic first hit, which, for I guess where I'm sitting, that was really March 2020 when we realised it was a real problem. One of my first concerns, beyond the human safety aspect, was that I hope this doesn't push sustainability and climate change back down the agenda again. Because every time something else comes to the fore, that over the last 15 plus years, we've tended to see a deceleration, whereas this time, remarkably, it has gone the other way. And I think there's a whole lot of psychological reasons that I won't attempt to analyse as to why that's happened, but it's clear globally that the pandemic, I think in the simplest of terms, has reshaped everyone's idea of how we live, what things can change that we thought couldn't change, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm pleased to say that one of the big shifts is how far up it's come now in terms of awareness. So the first thing is what I call the mainstreaming of climate change as an acknowledged critical issue. And that broadly now, wherever you go, in most parts of the world, it's acknowledged that to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we're going to need to drastically change the way governments, organisations, corporations, society operates, and that's definitely a big shift from where we've been in terms of the split around acceptance and denial, etc. So that's the first one. The next observation I've got is around the expansion of who owns the challenge and who owns the response and the action that's required. We're very much seeing now that all sectors of the global economy are assessing transition risk, whereas 10 years ago, I think, to be honest, it was largely seen as an energy sector problem. And as someone who's spent all of his career, 26 or 7 years in the energy sector, that's definitely what's pulled me into climate change is the energy transition and in response to it. But we're not seeing it now as an energy sector problem, which is great. And I think, as an example of that, if you look at the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum earlier in 2022, the number one risk identified across all regions, across all sectors, was climate change, which is, quite remarkable, I think, from where we've been in the decades prior. So that's a huge step. And interestingly, if you expand that and you look at the whole top 10 list, 5 of the top 10 are environmental risks, and most of the others are actually social. So global economy and geopolitics, while we're all very concerned and worried about them, don't dominate as much as you might think. The next one that's shifted is the drivers for change. So, and I often like to talk about the emergence of the pull rather than just the push for change. So I think, 15 years ago, a lot of our efforts in the electricity sector around trying to develop and roll out renewable energy a lot of it was in anticipation of a carbon price or some other form of regulation of emissions. Whereas if you look at the work we're doing now on, transition strategy and decarbonisation, a lot of it is effectively voluntary. It's and when I say voluntary, I mean, corporations decarbonising their business, their operations in response to some sort of consumer or investor expectation. So to be clear, we need both pull and push, and I think there's plenty of examples of that. And again, in terms of the push, there's various forms of regulation. I think New Zealand, is seen in a lot of ways to be leading already in terms of legislation and in terms of how that'll get rolled out. But I think some of the global frameworks, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, we've got a lot of voluntary compliance with the TCFDs now, a lot of expectation from investors, but also not from listed companies. We've got a lot of private companies and even government organisations using the TCFDs. So that's a big shift, and that'll just continue, right? We've got IFRS, creating the new International Sustainability Standards Board. So we'll see sustainability standards around reporting coming in through accounting guidelines. So to me, those are all positives because they provide the push, and I think consumers increasingly are providing the pull. People want products with low or zero embodied carbon. And then the last one I'll touch on before handing over to Felicity is just the responses. So the responses to transition risk have shifted as well. So we're now starting to get into the industries that we used to call difficult to decarbonise or hard to abate sectors. So, where we were previously, most of our work was focused around things like renewable energy procurement and just decarbonising people's electricity supply. We're now starting to get into the really complex industrial sectors, steel making, concrete production, heavy transport, even agriculture, and figuring out how to decarbonise those. And then the only other thing I'd say about the shift in the responses is that carbon offsets, while there's still a response, they're largely being seen as a last resort now. So yes, we will need plenty of carbon offsets. We'll need a lot more of them. But I see a growing view that they should be reserved for the parts of the economy that really don't have a technological answer to decarbonisation yet. So I think that's a good spot for me to pause and hand over to Felicity.
Thanks, Paul. Kia ora koutou. Felicity Underhill. I look after New Zealand and East Australia for Fortescue Future Industries. And like Paul, I'm based on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Meanjin, which is the Turrbal name for Brisbane. And I'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians. A bit like Te Ao Māori, their respect for land and waters are affected by the climate change challenge, which we're going to be talking about today. I've had 20 years in oil and gas, and having moved into hydrogen in 2018, I like to say that I am now finally on the side of angels. What I'm going to do today is talk a bit about who Fortescue is and what we are doing in response to climate change. And I think the history of Fortescue really represents the give it a go mentality that we're going to need as we all race to try and halt or put a dent in the climate change impacts we're seeing around the world. Fortescue was founded less than 20 years ago to take on the big Aussie miners of Rio and BHP in Western Australia. It opened its first mine in just 4 years and is now one of the largest companies in the Aussie stock market, selling some of the lowest cost iron ore to global customers. And their operating model is founded on lowest cost operations, strong long-term sustainable relationships with community and off-takers. We're always going to need mining. If we want growth, we need steel, and therefore we will need iron ore. But currently extracting it is an emission-loaded business. We emit about 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And about 5 or 6 years ago, we really started looking at what it would take to cut this. We did this out of a sense of purpose. And we also did this because we know our customers and our communities and our children expect it from us. So we've set ourselves some of the most ambitious carbon targets in the world. We've committed to net zero operations by 2030 and net zero across our entire supply chain by 2040. So net zero operations means stopping our reliance on diesel. And we use almost 750 million litres of diesel every year. If we did nothing by 2030, that number would be closer to 1 billion when you take into account our growth aspirations. And it means shifting both our stationary and our mobile fleet to electric or hydrogen. And our net zero supply chain target means that we need to convert all of our iron ore carriers and ships to run off ammonia. And then we need to work with our customers to find a way to produce green steel. When we set those targets, we realized that the equipment didn't exist and in fact wasn't going to exist in the timeline that we'd need it. So we started building our own. We put in place what we call our green fleet and green industry team and got them building. They last year put the first hydrogen-powered drill rig in prototype operation. We are testing both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell haul trucks. Those are those big 7-meter high, hundreds of kilogram trucks. They're giant. We've put ammonia and fuel for rail. We are converting a ship and a marine engine to run off ammonia that should be on the water within a year. We've recently, working with Williams Advanced Engineering, have come up with the concept of an infinity train, which is a pretty cool concept where we have these 3-kilometer long trains which carry almost 40,000 tonnes of iron ore from the mines in the Pilbara on a slight downward slope towards the coast. We can store enough energy from going downhill and braking to be able to power the train to go back to the top with an empty load. And so it can continuously run without any external forms of energy. So we're really having to do a lot of pretty cool, you can imagine it's dream job for some of these people working in these workshops, trying these things out. But we also realized that the renewable energy and the hydrogen fuel that we needed wasn't going to be available at the scale we needed. And so we started building those projects as well. And we realized that if we need it, if we need this technology, if we need this renewable energy, if we need this hydrogen, so will others. And so we started Fortescue Future Industries. And so Fortescue Metals Group has transitioned from a pure play iron ore miner through to a vertically integrated renewable energy and renewable products company. FFI is now present in over 20 countries, including New Zealand, and we're targeting producing 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030. To put that in context, 15 million tonnes is equivalent to 3 times New Zealand's entire energy requirements and would be enough to power almost 20% of the global shipping fleet. It would take more than 150 to 200 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity to produce that hydrogen. And we set ourselves a giant stretch target like this for 3 reasons. We need scale to be able to put a dent in our addiction to fossil fuels and give ourselves a chance at putting a dent in climate change. And the second reason is when you think big, you've got to think differently. And we need to think both big and differently to bring down the costs of hydrogen and renewable energy to really help everyone on this transition. And then the third reason is with that much green hydrogen supply, there's no excuse for countries and companies to not also make the same changes that we're starting to make in our own operations. So we're now in a position where we're driving both the decarbonisation of FMG zone operations, leading massive scale up of renewables across solar, wind, hydro and geothermal around the world, investing in technologies to help scale, improve efficiencies and reduce cost, and working on some of the largest energy deals ever done, having agreed to sell 5 million tonnes per annum of green hydrogen to E.ON to help Germany reduce its reliance on Russian gas. I think the last thing I'd say before, Tom, I hand back to you, is that the sense of purpose in the team at FMG and FFI is palpable, and it's unlike anything I've experienced before. We actually have alignment all the way through the organisation, from our founder and chair, through our board, throughout the whole organisation, about the sense of purpose that we're working towards, and the energy and collaboration that unlocks across the organisation is just incredible. Tom.
Thank you, Felicity. I love the naming of the Infinity Train. I'll be looking forward to my Infinity bike to be helping me get around Auckland. Paul, I'll call on you next, and I'd love for you to talk about what you're seeing across businesses that are leading in their transition journeys and how they're thinking about business risk and the opportunities kind of on the flip side of those risks.
Yeah, sure thing, Tom. I'll do that. So I think first up, I'd say the businesses that we see that are really leading on climate risk and transition strategy are the ones that have made that the central pillar of their overall strategy. So not a separate task off to the side. There's still plenty of organisations and firms and even governments who are operating that way, treating it as we've got BAU and then someone else can look at climate over on the side. But the real key to victory here is for your whole strategy to be centred around this, because it's the most existential threat that we have as a species. And I think, to give you an example, the best quote I've had from one of the CEOs that we work with, and I'm not quoting Felicity's boss here, this is a different company, when I was talking to him last year about transition strategy, he said, we've changed. He said, there is no transition strategy now for us. It's just the strategy. And that was great, because that was them acknowledging that in the space they're in, if they don't pivot really hard now, they're unlikely to still be around in 5 to 10 years. So there's a lot of firms that aren't there yet in terms of making it central to the overall business strategy. But I think those that are really doing well are the ones that have taken that approach. The next thing is, I think businesses that are leading are the ones that are seeing themselves as part of a supply chain, part of an ecosystem, rather than just seeing themselves as an island. And that used to be how business strategy was done for all of us. We would always just look at there's a physical boundary here, here's our organisation, let's set a strategy. Whereas now, acknowledging the scale of the transition and the scale of the risks around climate change, and therefore going, okay, we're not going to solve this as a singular entity. We need to look at ourselves as part of the ecosystem and say, where are the efficiencies? Where can we collaborate? For example, who's best placed to decarbonise this part of the supply chain? Or, can we help our suppliers on their own journey? Can we encourage them on that journey rather than just cutting them and finding someone else? That's definitely a key. The other one is it's those firms that are really going deep on what are the impacts of our transition strategy on the communities that support us. And I think the best way to talk about this is probably by our example, right? So some of the work we're doing with one of the, a global mining company, is that as they're transitioning off fossil fuel as an energy supply for some of their mining and minerals processing operations, that's obviously a great outcome environmentally. There's a coal mine there that will now be redundant and be closed down. But what that means locally is that more than 80% of the employment opportunities in that remote region disappear with the coal mine, and they're not replaced by the renewable energy source that's going to take its place. And so factoring in those community and employment outcomes into your transition strategy is really vital. And that's what, the phrase that many of you have heard, no doubt, the just transition, that's what just transition is all about, is to acknowledge that, the impacts of this are complex, and that, while it is definitely true that there are more jobs in a decarbonised economy, they're not necessarily the same jobs, and they're not necessarily in the same locations. So that really does mean potentially, a fair bit of disruption and difficult choices for families and communities. So that's key. The next one is the firms that are leading are the ones that are looking at climate transition risk and climate physical risk in tandem. Because while they're very different topics that require very different expertise, both will shape your asset and business decisions, and one could easily stand the other if you don't consider them at the same time. And so what we're seeing is a lot more need for scenario planning, because while you have some control over your own transition, your own net zero roadmap, for example, you might control your path to net zero, but we're all in each other's hands when it comes to the global decarbonisation race, and therefore which climate physical scenario plays out for us. Is it a 1.5 degree scenario, a 2, a 3, hopefully not a 4, but those scenarios have vastly different outcomes for your business model, for your assets, for the communities, your workforce, etc. And so you've got to be actually running the scenarios for both, and then making the asset and business model decisions that are right for transition and for the physical shifts, because sadly there is a certain amount of physical change already upon us. And even if we do hold at a 1.5 degree scenario, or more likely just under 2, we still got a whole lot of different physical impacts that we're going to have to work with and live with. The next thing is it's the organisations that are moving away from the short-termism and the 2 to 3 year planning cycles that a lot of us have used for a long time, and instead looking at what's our 10 to 20 year plan, And then, what are the critical capabilities and skills that we're going to need now, and invest in that for, Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. So again, that becoming more central rather than a secondary exercise to business planning. The final one I'd talk about is purpose. Felicity touched on it just before, but it's a really big one for me as well. And that is the firms that are linking their strategy to purpose are the ones that I think are winning. And while this might sound like a nice thing to do, I actually think it's actually be one of the key criteria for success, because when you think about it, we're all in a competition for scarce talent. Whatever sector you're in, having the right people, getting the right talent, attracting and retaining them is actually one of the fundamental hurdles, or determinants of success or failure. And so that talent is increasingly looking for more than just a financial outcome when they decide who they want to work for. So, and look, I think if you can't find purpose and meaning in tackling climate change, you probably should check your pulse and make sure you're still alive, because I think, to me, it's the greatest thing that that confronts humanity. So, aligning some part of what you do as a business to tackling climate change is a fantastic way to engage your people with purpose. I think that's all I've got to say there in terms of what businesses are leading. Tom?
Great, thank you, Paul. And I'm sure that we'll get a few questions on that kind of to dig into it. Felicity, I might call on you if you don't mind. Sort of building on this, what are you seeing as the challenges, opportunities within New Zealand businesses that you're talking to and that you're meeting with?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think the number one piece for us is that there are actually very few businesses for whom the energy transition forms the core of your work. And yet we all need to become experts and work out how we can build confidence in the energy transition to enable making business decisions in an uncertain environment. A lot of the stuff is still leading edge, but how do you make long-term decisions when infrastructure and supply chain may not yet be in place? Being an early mover places operational and financial risk on businesses. And so, there's a real challenge around that. And it's something that we need to think about in developing the full ecosystems of support around regulations and framework and infrastructure to enable these things to happen. Likewise, the newly decarbonised products aren't yet established in scale, and we know we need scale to both bring down cost and de-risk it for companies to move over. Thinking about how we might be making decisions to replace existing fleet or existing processes or elements of existing assets. These are, really important investment decisions. Often they're the biggest asset that a company holds that needs to be invested in order to decarbonize. And without that clarity, without that forward view around what is the best technology to choose, what is the direction that we should be going, it's tough. So I think that that level of uncertainty for decision makers is probably one of the biggest challenges. When I talk about ecosystem, the government and regulatory framework piece is another one that needs to be in place to really support that. Ensuring that we can jointly develop definitive sort of pathways and strategies, master plans with government. And that's not just national governments, it's local and regional governments as well. What level of role, clarity of role do they play? How can they best kind of support and enable businesses? What kind of, again, how can we help build certainty for businesses around a decarbonisation pathway? It is really key for us. We believe that we will be able to become the lowest cost producer of green hydrogen in the areas in which we operate. That's our core business. The customers that we work with, it's just one element. And so I'm looking for that guidance and that support for end users and customers rather than the companies for whom it's their core business. And then finally, again, we talk about purpose, but quite specifically for individual businesses, what will our clients and customers pay for? So what are the expectations that they have on us to go green? But then what green premium or value do they place on decarbonised services or industry? Will they pay for it, or will it just become a license to operate expectation? Do we see this as an opportunity to differentiate our products or businesses? You know, one of the things that we look at for FMG is that by 2030, with our net zero operations, we will be selling green iron ore, right? And by within the few years thereafter, we'll be shipping it in zero carbon ships. And, you know, it will have zero embedded carbon in it, which is a weird thought for iron ore, but is, you know, a really core part of it. And we do that because we think it's right, and also because it will differentiate us from other products on the market. So I think those are really live challenges for businesses as we explore the decisions that need to be made in order to transition. And I think one thing that will make that easier is how do we ensure that our businesses get access to experts and accurate information and up-to-date information to help inform and guide them in that decision making across technology, products, learning curves, costs, etc., so that all of that can be fed into the decision making.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that access to experts and the ability to find the people, and even down to financing and funding, you know, there's so many people and, you know, roads to explore, that knowing who to call and when to call on them is actually a really big part of what's going to make, you know, transition successful. So I would call on people to start putting in questions if you have them. I've got a couple lined up. The first one, kind of just starting us now with that kind of looking forwards view, which is Felicity, I'll go to you, and then Paul, kind of your perspective around what's, you know, one strategic advantage that, you know, we have in New Zealand Inc., or there's New Zealand businesses that we should be leveraging more of, you know, and what's, you know, similarly kind of on the other side, what's, you know, a disadvantage or a challenge that we need to be more proactive and focus on?
So I'm going to be cheeky and give you three very quick advantages. One is, and you mentioned it earlier, Tom, our proud history of doing things first and giving it a go, from whether it's flight or refrigeration, and you mentioned FPOS as well. You know, that innovation, that creativity, that willingness to give it a try is something that has existed in New Zealand. You know, it's right down the core of who we are. So we need to keep doing that. The other thing that I've noticed, and we've worked, you know, around the world, but that Team New Zealand ethos, the New Zealand Inc. approach, and the desire to collaborate and work together is far more evident here than it is in other countries. And we actually see it in practice here. I think there's a lot of lovely words said about collaboration and working together elsewhere. I see far more evidence of it in New Zealand than elsewhere. And then finally, you know, the whole reputation of New Zealand globally, about, you know, the pure New Zealand marketing campaigns, the kind of the really climate change engaged environment that we have. It is something that is part of our reputation and who we are. I think that's a third advantage, right? Which is, how do we keep that? How do we monetize that? And how do we commercialize that and make it real? So 3 advantages. One disadvantage, and it's something which can and needs to change, is, you know, power costs a lot in New Zealand. And it's for a country with such natural advantages, we need to do what we can to incentivize and enable far more renewables into the grid to bring down cost, to enable and increase electrification, and to enable new industry. And so, you know, it's one thing for us to make sure the technology is there for electrification, but actually we need to really look at that as the supply side of renewable energy. There's a huge amount of potential both onshore and offshore for New Zealand renewable energy, and I think that's something that over time really needs to be exploited more.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot of that challenge in terms of, you know, we want to electrify and decarbonize, but yet, you know, going into a market that there's some uncertainty about and some challenges with. So certainly echo that in my experience. Paul, to you.
Yeah, thanks. And you'll probably notice a few similarities here. Perhaps I should have pinged Felicity in the background about what her advantages were. So look, my first one is Felicity's number 3. And so I guess the primary advantage I see is it's a combination of reality and perception for New Zealand. So as an Aussie who's spent a lot of time in New Zealand and even lived there for a year, I think it's fair to say that New Zealand has what I would call a very green brand globally for a whole bunch of reasons. So that's the perception part. And that perception's been created over a long period of time. So to me, to extend that and therefore say the notion of New Zealand being an exporter of products with zero embodied carbon is a very natural fit, a very strong fit. And when I say products, I mean all products. So whether that be from dairy to tourism, doesn't really matter. So that is I think it will pass a credibility test and it'll allow you to play in a global market that's hungry for decarbonised products very well. So that's the perception part. The reality part is that you have a fantastic renewable energy resource, and hence the electricity grid's well on the way to being decarbonised. The barrier at the moment is that you need a lot more capacity in there to bring the wholesale price down. And I think you can look across the ditch and if you look at what happened in South Australia with its own energy transition, there's a lot of panic back in 2016, 2017 about if it gets north of 50% renewables, how unreliable is it going to be? Well, it's regularly exceeding 100% renewable generation there, and on variable renewables too, wind and solar, not endowed with the hydro and geothermal that you've got in New Zealand. And it's got usually got the best wholesale price in the country, the lowest price. So opening up capacity is key there. And the other thing I'd say, you don't have a dominant fossil fuel sector to transition. Obviously, you've got some, but it isn't the proportionality that has caused a lot of issues in, say, parts of North America or the Middle East. So I think that's an advantage. The disadvantages, I didn't see too many, other than what I touched on with opening up more renewables into the market, the electricity market. I think the only one I thought of was really possibly the exposure of the agriculture sector to climate physical risks. And, that's where you really get reminded that it's a global effort to keep the world at that 1.5 to 2 degree future. And that's really important for an economy like New Zealand's. So therefore, you need the whole world to keep accelerating the transition, therefore be an advocate and a role model of the transition.
Great. Thank you, Paul. All right, I have a question here from Scott, which was, there was a mention of economic growth being compatible with decarbonisation. Isn't this buying into a myth and belief in limitless resources? So Felicity, I might throw to you first on this one and then get Paul, any thoughts from you after Felicity?
Yeah, let me say 2 things on that, Tom. Scott, number one, thing we should all be looking at is efficiency and reduction in energy use. And when you look at any of the forward projections around how we might be able to get back to a 1.5 degree aligned kind of climate pathway, efficiency and energy reduction is a key part of that. So that is a key part of the transition. I do think, though, that you can have economic growth and decarbonisation hand in hand. And in some areas, we're seeing ourselves almost be put on a war footing to be able to address some of the challenges that we need in terms of investment in renewable energy, investment in the infrastructure and the technology that goes alongside that. We think about what's happening in the Asian markets, where they are looking at what is the next opportunity for car makers, what is the next opportunity, and actually being able to completely rebrand and rebuild on electrical BEV, battery electric vehicles, or fuel cell electric vehicles is a whole new market for these customers and these companies and countries which rely on those. So I think you can do both, but you absolutely need to have that energy efficiency and reduction as part of the story. Paul, what would you add?
Yeah, that's great, Felicity. I think what I was reflecting on when you were talking there is, I think I've had a lot of learnings from, I guess, another task that I have within our business, which is managing our own journey to net zero. So, Aurecon's committed to be net zero globally by 2025, and that task is a lot easier for professional services firm than it is for a mining company, I can assure you. However, there's still plenty of work to it. And so as we go through that process of obviously cataloguing all of our emissions, but then what's the roadmap to get each of those to zero? For those that are very difficult to abate at the moment, like air travel, the best answer is don't get on the plane, right? So in terms of doing less and using less, for us, we've definitely taken that approach with air travel and said, look, we still need to fly as part of how we do our work, absolutely. But we're certainly questioning which flights and how many flights, and do all these things need to be done on a plane, or how many can be done using the technology we're using right now. So for us, there is definitely a reduction, a reduced component. And I think similarly with looking at land transport, when I've been looking at that stream in our emissions reduction strategy, replacing all of our light vehicles with EVs is the like-for-like approach. But what we're actually going is, well, how many trips need to be taken with one or two people in a car, and how many could be taken in a different way? Because obviously there's a much lower, carbon footprint associated with putting someone on a train, electrified train that's being supplied by 100% renewable energy, which is possible in a lot of our locations. So yeah, I think where you can reduce and not do a like-for-like, because even the decarbonised like-for-like still has an impact. So I agree with the premise of the question. I do think there's a whole lot of things, though, that you still just need to do, and that's the response I get, for example, from the geotechs in our business. When I say we're getting some EVs in to replace the little cars, they're like, yes, but I need a ute full of stuff that I can drive for 5 hours out into the bush and measure this stuff. And so we say, yep, so acknowledge that for that one, that's the reality. For certain things at the moment, there isn't a way to just cut it.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, certainly my experience has been that if we build, when we get into clients and we talk to them and we build cost to abate curves, very rarely does that curve start as a net cost to the business. The early parts of these curves across good chunks of decarbonising are now, break even, or if not better, and saving money, particularly as we start to factor in a carbon cost around that. So I think that's kind of echoes my experience, what both of you have said. I have a question here from Wendy for you, Paul, which is, if you had someone who was starting their transition journey now, where would you start? What would be the thing that you did?
Yeah, so I mentioned in one of those earlier sections the importance of scenario planning. So you obviously need to have a baseline for where are you today and what are your red flag risks in that context. So global economy is decarbonising. Where do you sit in that? Where is your core business directly exposed? And then where is your supply chain exposed? And so do that red flag analysis and then say, okay, these are the areas that we're going to need to go and do a deep dive on. And then at the same time, start some scenario analysis work on the climate physical impacts. And that the reason I keep labouring that why it's important to look at physical and transition together is because your transition strategy might lead you to some quite large decisions around your assets or your business model. And if you don't factor in what's happening physically in that location at the same time, you could really place a very bad bet there. So I think, and again, if I use mining sector as an example, and the reason I do keep using mining companies and energy companies is because they've been the most exposed, and that's probably where the blowtorch has been applied first, I think. And so that's where we got a lot of our learnings that we're now taking into other sectors. But to just go to my example, so if you're a resource company and you've looked at transition and said, we need to change our commodity portfolio to be future facing. So we got out of fossil fuels, we're now just in battery minerals, for example. But then if you don't look at where are those battery minerals and what's their path to market, and you don't acknowledge that all of the export terminals are in areas that are already seeing more cyclones, so greater frequency of cyclones, greater intensity of cyclones, more flooding. And so you build your whole business around that transition change, and you haven't factored in that physical risk that region's exposed to, and just how much that'll impact your operations, then you're obviously going to be doing a great disservice to your shareholders. So to me, that's the key message is, yep, look at transition at a high level, do the red flags, and then do the scenario analysis on physical risk.
Great, thank you. Felicity, I have one here for you, asked by someone who's anonymous. So bulk green hydrogen will be in demand as an export product. exposing our power price, our electricity price to the global green hydrogen price. Does that undermine the perceived competitive advantage of being able to produce zero carbon products, zero carbon energy?
Yeah, I love this one. So thank you, whoever asked it. And I think it's a really important piece for us to align on what the opportunity for hydrogen is in New Zealand. Hydrogen sits alongside electrification. So we need electrification first and foremost with as much renewable electricity as we can bring on stream. Where electrification doesn't work, that's where hydrogen comes in. You're going to need a green molecule at times. Heavy industry, some of the agricultural and fertilizer uses, heavy transport, coastal shipping, these are areas where a green molecule in the form of hydrogen or a hydrogen carrier like ammonia will make sense. So alongside electrification, hydrogen will justify the investment in large-scale new renewable generation, which can supply both electrification and hydrogen production. Hydrogen production is incredibly flexible, and so it can be turned down at times of need, releasing that additional renewable energy back into the grid. It can help out with dry year response, but it can also help out in peak intraday demands as well. And so it'll actually help put downward pressure on power prices, not upward pressure on power prices. And ultimately, I think it will be a struggle for New Zealand green hydrogen to compete on a global stage as an export product, because of the cost of our renewable energy is going to be a struggle to compete with renewable energy from the Middle East or large scale in Australia or the US. But it will absolutely and definitely compete with the cost of imported fuels in New Zealand. So hydrogen produced in New Zealand for use in New Zealand is a really key part of the decarbonisation story. And it brings with it another strong advantage, which is one of energy security and fuel independence, one where we're no longer going to be tied to seeing an increased cost in diesel or increased cost in petrol because of global geopolitical challenges. It adds to not just that fact that we can decarbonise, but we can do it in a way where we have much more control over our own costs and our own destiny as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was thinking of energy security this morning as I listened to the radio, and as you mentioned before about the deal between FFI and into Germany. So I think that's great. Paul, for you, I have a question here. If you can solve this, I'm all ears, and I think it's going to be one that's a bit of a work in progress, but I'd love your take on it, which is Rutger asked a question around transitioning to a decarbonised electricity sector, and you can expand that and multiply the numbers probably, will require a lot of additional resources and people, between 5,000 and 10,000 between now and 2030. Where are we going to find these people around the globe, and how are we going to compete with others around the globe if they're doing the same?
Yeah, that is actually one of the biggest risks in the transition, is having access to, I talked about access to talent, access to resources, full stop. It's already starting to manifest itself, to be honest, and I'm sure Felicity would agree on that. I think we're looking at this in a number of ways. There's definitely a huge constraint on the specialists, call them the subject matter experts who are at the core of energy transition. So as a capability, there's a real crunch on there, and that's a global one, and we are all competing for that resource pool. And I think another challenge for New Zealand and for Australia is obviously the mobility has been limited through COVID. I think the willingness of people to relocate is not quite as strong as it used to be. We used to just be able to open the gates and you'd have 1,000 extra workers come into New Zealand. I think that's more challenging, and they've got more options too. There's some amazing energy transition work available in North America and in Europe now. So you don't have that differentiator. What we are really looking at is who are the people in adjacent areas that we can pivot and reskill? Because I think, to me, that's probably the only answer, or the only answer that scales. And then so we say, okay, well, we've identified that it is a transition. So obviously some sectors will be scaling down. So what do we need to do to help those people move across? And I think, there's a number of universities in this region, in ANZ and in Asia, that offer those sorts of courses, postgrad courses, you know, Masters of Sustainable Energy. There's some great examples of those to allow experienced people to pivot. Firstly, I think pivot out of fossil fuel into renewables or hydrogen or associated fields. That's got to be key. But then even from the sectors that are further, I guess, not as immediately adjacent, I think, you know, some like people out of transport, because it's not just the technical SMEs, it's all the other stuff, right? You need to have people who know, how do you do environmental permitting and approvals of this stuff? How do you do stakeholder, landholder, community consultation? All the stuff we've done for big road projects that we now need to do for, you know, new transmission lines and new wind farms, etc., to start to swing those people towards it. For me, that's the key one. And then the other one is there's obviously some parts of this supply chain that could be a digital answer. You know, some of the manual design work we do on energy assets, we're looking hard into what can we codify, what could actually be automated, because otherwise people are going to be the constraint.
Yeah, I think that productivity point is really important. That automation and being smarter around how we do use resources is really key. You know, if we keep on using people at the productivity that we have in New Zealand to do this, it will be very labour intensive. So I think productivity is a really important part. Felicity, I'm conscious that you also are probably thinking a lot about resourcing and people in your business. You know, how are you thinking about it? What are you doing?
Yeah, it is key, and I think I do think it's one of the biggest strategic challenges that we have through this time. It's also through the construction elements of infrastructure and renewable generation. A lot of that's going to be happening at the same time as a lot of other giant infrastructure projects around the world and around the region as well, and around the country. One of the things that helps us through that is often the location of our hydrogen or renewable energy projects are located where there is existing infrastructure, which may be areas where fossil fuel based companies are looking at a transition out. So, you know, we are looking at projects in Australia in the Hunter Valley, where the closure of a coal power plant will have a huge impact on job losses. We're looking at a conversion of an ammonia plant in the Brisbane River, which is currently running off natural gas and was due to close because of the price of natural gas. We're going to try and run that off green hydrogen instead. There's 400 jobs associated with that. Likewise, we've been looking at Marsden Point. We're looking at projects in areas where you have jobs that are currently reliant on fossil fuels. And so if we're able to, and I know Paul referred to the just transition, and I think you know, there's a key part of it, if we're able to have a pull for jobs in these regions outside metropolitan hubs, that'll be a really important part of actually enabling a sustainable benefit of the transition for the communities in which we're operating as well.
Awesome, thanks. There's some really interesting questions coming through, so I'm going to go and ask Paul and Felicity to do quick kind of responses for the next couple, and then I'll hand back to Tina as we head up towards 2 o'clock. So, Paul, starting with you, you know, you obviously have deep experience. This is a question from Scott, a different Scott. You know, what's your experience with board governance? And understanding legal and financial risk in the decarbonisation transition, and how you help them understand their exposure to risk and the changes in profile there and potentially increased risk.
Yeah, that's been, I think it's fair to say that's been a pretty steep learning curve for a number of board directors in the last 5 years. I think that the requirement for boards now to have one or more non-exec directors who are actually really literate on climate and on carbon is extremely important. I think there was an interesting stat, 2021 stat, that showed that Australia was second only to the US in terms of climate-based legal cases. So firms, organisations being sued for some sort of climate outcome by either an individual or a community group, and that trend has only increased. So boards now having to really step up their literacy on the topic. Interesting to see too that the AICD, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, if you look at their the main board preparation course they provide now, nearly 50% of it is focused on this particular topic. So I think there has been an increase in capability. I think it still has a way to go. I think that the makeup of boards is really key here, and this is where diversity on your board is vital. And I mean diversity of obviously of gender, but also of age and of background, because as I said in the early part, this isn't just an energy sector problem or a fossil fuel problem. It'll hit everyone's supply chain in some way, and there's opportunities in there as well. But yeah, it's very much an issue for the board now.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. I am not going to get to all of the questions, so I have to apologise for those who have asked questions that we haven't got to. But I thought I would throw one last question to Felicity and then Paul, which is the government budget comes out on Thursday, and it's been billed as the climate budget. What would be the top of your wish list in that budget that you would love to see and you think would make the biggest impact?
All right, investment in regulatory regime to help give that certainty we've been talking about throughout. Also certainty on infrastructure planning to be able to, help businesses invest in a new fleet, knowing that there's going to be infrastructure at the time that is needed. And then, finally, I think the third one is similar as well. It's that support and a pathway to help businesses make the choices and decisions that they need to be able to make. So, companies that, as I said before, their core business is doing renewable energy or your core business is doing hydrogen. That's not where the support is needed. The support is needed for the companies who are needing to work out how they transition.
Great. Paul, anything that would be top of your wish list?
Yeah, I had a really specific one, and that's investment in network or transmission infrastructure. So if you look at I guess, we broadly call this the enabling technologies. So we know that the cost of bulk solar and bulk wind is extremely low and really competitive with fossil fuel, but only if you can get enough of it into the system at the right time. And usually the barrier to that is a network constraint. And so rather than needing to put the money into the renewable generator, it's actually the enabling infrastructure. So taking a view so that rather than one project having to underpin a new piece of transmission, that you can say, the government will underwrite that, and then that'll allow multiple parties to connect and compete on the, a reverse auction or similar to get the lowest price into your wholesale market. That's what I'd put on my list.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Felicity. And Tina, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, speakers, and thank you, facilitator, for today. And actually, thank you, Aurecon, for partnering with us on that. I've got about 5 key points that I found were really interesting to maybe flesh out briefly before we finish. And one that stuck with me, the first one was there's really no lack on solutions from what I hear. But there is obviously only one limit that we could apply to tackle climate change, and that would be to limit us to one solution. I think that was a little bit the theme of today's conversation. Also, I hear that transition strategies should really focus on the outcome of communities and employment outcomes, which is really insightful and relevant. And therefore, it is really important to do scenario modeling that actually considering transitional risks, but also adaptational risks or physical risks, and how your business fits in the overall ecosystem to make better decisions, because it's not us alone, obviously, as business owners or business supporters. And then but that we see the shift from push to pull strategy. So it's more the consumer starting to ask for the right investments to happen, which is a good sign, but it also means that we have to provide guidance to consumers and businesses that are transitioning on how they can transition, because they're not just focusing on things like renewable energy and hydrogen. There's much more for them to consider. So there's where the help is needed. And the last one is that transitioning to climate change centered question gives you a chance to rebrand. So it was really interesting to hear, in particular for businesses in New Zealand, we are exporters, to see where the chances are if you are transitioning to a more climate change focused company, that there's obviously rebranding chance and then there is new markets you could explore. So on that note, there are my 5 key points for today, and I'm glad we had such good speakers today. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Tina. And thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you all.